something satisfactory, and when is something insufficient and so on. You get the problem of grading and pass-fail. Always very, very difficult. And you have to make it easier for yourself to get a bit of a consensus between the assessors, to maybe make checklists, to talk about it, to say, well, what do I really think is a good standard, and what is not completely good, what is outstanding, what is just good, what is unsatisfactory. This matter of grading and pass-fail has two important issues. You can always think, well, it is a relative. In a group, always 20% should fail. That's what happens. There's somewhere in the other paper it put the name posthumous. It's a law of posthumous. It's a Netherlands law, so it's not very well known. He said, what they saw in secondary schools is that always 20% of the pupils fail. How is that? Because you make the norms relative. If you think it is a bit too many, you can't have 80% or 60% of the students fail. Then you say, well, we go to the group and the lowest 20% are just not good enough. That's a way of, well, making a pass-fail decision. The other one could be the absolute norm and say, well, no, this is the content matter, this is the learning outcome, I have my standards, if they fail, they fail. You have to choose and always sometimes mix those two approaches, which is not very easy. There's a lot of test theory behind it. Well, anyway, that should be part of the discussion. Then the conditions of assessment. Many things will now be related to thesis work, writing articles, and of course plagiarism. How do you know that it is the work of a student or maybe the work of a very intelligent Google fanatic? Could well be. There are all kinds of means to look at that, but it should be in the end the assessment of an authentic demonstration of a student and not of somebody who has handed in something. I think in particular with those long-distance learning institutions, they could have a problem in the authenticity of student results. Always very important. Transparency, of course, you have to make clear what you will allow and what not. And then the most important thing, how do you get consensus? To have and to make consensus is already a kind of a cultural revolution, I would say. Because many teachers, many professors would think, I know how to assess. I did it always myself, and so who is going to interfere with me? I think for proper assessment that is accepted not only by the student body, but also by society at large, you need to have a bigger consensus about professors, staff, even students in participating there, to say, well, these are the standards that belong to a certain learning outcome. If we talk about use multiple instructional models, you have to discuss with many people of your staff, say, well, and these are the things you are going to look at, and the students should agree with that, and maybe even the outsiders, the stakeholders should agree with that. Consensus between a lot of people is more important than the one professor who up to now maybe decided this is the pass and this is the fail. But that also requires a bit of cultural change now and again, because it's not so easy. We were talking yesterday, why are these learning outcomes not so popular? It is not so easy for professors who are superior in their knowledge base to allow others to discuss the levels of passing or failing learning outcomes. So much for assessing learning outcomes for the time being. I'd like to go to some final things, and all this, of course, learning outcomes are very closely related to learning to students. They are first, sorry, Martin.
Excuse me, about consensus. What is the idea to introduce in this consensus the students as well, or a group?
I think the students
in a representative way, also the students.
Yeah. Well, I think in the end also, I think it should start with the experts. One professor, more staff, junior staff, say, well, this is a concept of colleagues from other universities, peers, and say, well, if we think that using this multiple instructional thing consists of this and that, do we all find the same thing with it? Do we all have the same image of it? And even students should understand and say, oh, well, this is irrelevant or that. But I think student participation in the end is also very important.
Thank you.
Why are learning outcomes important? Robert Santa, a Romanian student, now in the ESU representative board, said on an ENCA conference in Vienna, September, for instance, we think it is very important to facilitate choice and motivation for students to know what learning outcomes are and to know it in a precise way. They can choose, as Tony already said, oh, if this course is going for multiple users, I only want this, then someone will not attend my course. I'm sorry. But that's how it is. It makes it possible for students to choose for what course you will go in order to pass that course. It makes it also possible to make flexible learning paths. You can say, well, here I can gain this one, there I can gain that one. If you are really in a mood that say, well, we can compare learning outcomes and they are compatible with each other and they build upon each other, it makes flexible learning paths easier. It could increase also objectivity in assessment and make teaching and learning more transparent. You know what you are learning for, as well as the teacher knows what he is teaching for. And thus, that's the end, it will help foster student-centered learning. And that's, of course, the perspective of the students, but they think that by being more clear on learning outcomes, and particularly on assessing the learning outcomes, it will help the more student-oriented educational system. But the same Robert Santa said, I experience also problems, and one is there's no culture of talking about learning outcomes at all. That's true, because in many universities are very individual chairs of faculties, and they do it for themselves, and we don't know. It's not a culture. You have to really get in the mood of discussing learning outcomes. And it's also a risk, he said, that you will go for the practical applications only, employability. And there's also a problem, he said, that maybe you think a learning outcome in an institution like Bucharest University, that's the only valid one. While there may be different paths to reach the same learning outcomes, maybe by having some kind of secondment to a kind of factory or whatever, to your employer, and there reach the same learning outcomes. Also, then I come back to myself, there is a problem also with learning outcomes, that it will reduce the scope of teaching and learning. There's this expression, teaching to the test. This is what you teach, I won't teach anything else. You can also get learning to the test, the minimum standards. And I think that was what Martin Hauser was pointing on yesterday. There are values that are wider than the specific context even to be grasped in a formulated learning outcome. I was reading about a British school in the Netherlands, and they had a very nice expression. They said, a student who will come from this school is inspired to develop a love for learning and a respect for others. That is, of course, a learning outcome, to have a love for learning. So you can say, you can be very specific, like this sheet, and have, oh, you can know this and that. Yeah, but maybe it's very important also to have more general learning outcomes. How are you going to